The scent of smoke still lingered in the air, faint but persistent, like the memory of something that refused to die. Lucia stood motionless in front of the charred remains of La Casa del Café, the modest restaurant that had been her parents' pride and her only source of income. Her hands trembled, not just from exhaustion, but from the ache of knowing that everything familiar had turned to ashes overnight. Beside her, little Sophia clutched tightly to a worn-out stuffed rabbit, her wide eyes darting anxiously around the empty square. She hadn't spoken since the fire. Not a word, not a cry, just silence, as though the flames had stolen her voice along with their home. With no place left to go, Lucia led her sister up the narrow path to a dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of Santa Clara. It was abandoned, forgotten by time and people, but it had 4 walls and a roof. That was all Lucia needed now. As she pushed open the creaking door, dust motes swirled in the shafts of afternoon light, and the cold emptiness of the place seeped into her bones. Later that evening, Gabriel Soto stood at the edge of the forest, surveying the faint column of smoke that still rose from the direction of the town. He had arrived in Santa Clara only days ago, intending to assess the land for the expansion of his new hotel project, a luxury hacienda that would fuse modern elegance with rustic charm. But now there was something far more immediate drawing his attention. As he approached the cabin, he saw movement inside. 2 figures, a woman and a child. Their silhouettes were framed by the fading light, their presence an intrusion on what should have been an unoccupied property. He knocked gently, then pushed the door open. Lucia spun around, shielding Sophia instinctively, her eyes fierce and guarded. Her face bore the unmistakable marks of recent violence, a bruised cheekbone, a cut along her jawline, and a look of someone who had been fighting for far too long. Gabriel raised his hands in a gesture of peace and spoke calmly. "I'm not here to hurt you." Lucia said nothing. She simply watched him, breathing heavily, her body tense like a cornered animal. "I'm Gabriel Soto," he continued, scanning the room and noting the bare essentials. No food, no heat, only the child's stuffed rabbit, resting on a frayed blanket. "This cabin belongs to my family, but you're welcome to stay, for now." Lucia finally found her voice, though it came out brittle. "We didn't know. We needed somewhere." Gabriel nodded slowly, his gaze resting briefly on Sophia, who was now hiding behind her sister's legs, her eyes peeking out cautiously. "It's okay," he said softly, almost more to himself than to them. "You can stay." He turned to leave, but paused as he reached the door. He looked back at Lucia's face, noticing the fading purples and reds of the bruises. The image stayed with him as he stepped out into the twilight, his mind replaying the quiet desperation he had just witnessed. The next morning, Gabriel returned, carrying a bag filled with bread, bottled water, and a thermos of coffee. As he approached the cabin, he saw Lucia sitting on the steps, her eyes distant as she stared at the line where the forest met the horizon. Sophia sat beside her, silently drawing in the dirt with a stick. Lucia glanced up as he set the bag down next to her. She opened her mouth to speak, but then hesitated, unsure whether to thank him or tell him to go. "You're not from here," she said finally, her tone flat, more an observation than a question. "No," Gabriel replied, sitting on a nearby rock. "But I used to be. I grew up in Santa Clara." Lucia looked away, tracing circles in the dust with her fingertip. He didn't press her for details, but the silence between them grew heavy until she broke it with a confession, her voice barely audible. "The restaurant was my parents'. They passed it on to me, and I failed them." Gabriel tilted his head. "You didn't fail. Someone burned it down." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "You don't understand." "Then explain." Lucia inhaled sharply, as if drawing strength from the air itself. "Ricardo Peralta." The name tasted bitter on her tongue. Gabriel's expression shifted, recognizing it immediately. Peralta was infamous even beyond Santa Clara, landowner, businessman, and, from what Gabriel had heard, a man who always collected what he believed was owed to him by any means necessary. Lucia continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. I borrowed money from him. I thought I could save the restaurant, keep it running after my parents died. At first it was fine, but then he started adding interest that I couldn't possibly pay, and when I refused the other forms of payment, he suggested— Her voice broke, and she turned her face away, ashamed. Gabriel clenched, his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. He could almost hear the unspoken parts of her story, threats, harassment, violence. He said he'd take Sophia away, Lucia added finally, her voice raw. Said I was an irresponsible guardian, that the courts would believe him. Gabriel looked at the little girl, now sitting cross-legged, quietly humming a tune, oblivious to the weight of her sister's words. Then he looked back at Lucia, whose face was a mask of exhaustion and defiance. I'm sorry, he said, though the words felt insufficient. She shrugged, as if apologies were meaningless to someone who had run out of options. I don't know why I'm telling you all this, she muttered. Gabriel stood up, brushing dust from his jeans. Because you needed to. Lucia didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. As he walked back toward town, Gabriel's mind wrestled with the image of Lucia's bruised face and Sophia's hollow silence. His hotel project suddenly seemed less urgent, less important. There was something else now, something he couldn't quite name, but couldn't ignore either. That evening, as darkness settled over Santa Clara and the wind whispered through the eucalyptus trees, Gabriel sat alone on the porch of the hacienda. He had come to renovate. The moon hung low over the hills, casting long shadows across the land. He could still see Lucia's eyes in his mind, the quiet defiance, the buried terror. And he realized that he wasn't just witnessing someone else's fight. Whether he intended to or not, he was becoming part of it. Far off in the distance, from the direction of the cabin, a faint sound reached his ears. Sophia's voice, singing quietly in the night, the first sound she had made since the fire, and, with that fragile melody carried on the breeze, Gabriel understood that this was only the beginning. The following days unfolded in a tense, fragile routine. Gabriel visited the cabin daily, bringing supplies and checking on Lucia and Sophia, though neither asked him to. He told himself it was simple human decency, but deep down he knew it was more than that. There was something about the quiet strength Lucia exuded even in her brokenness, and the way Sophia clung to her without words, that unsettled him in ways he wasn't ready to admit. Lucia remained guarded, but over time, the edge in her voice softened. She accepted the food he brought without protest, and occasionally offered small updates about Sophia, who still hadn't spoken since the fire. One afternoon, Gabriel arrived to find Lucia kneeling beside her sister, helping her fold sheets of paper into small, uneven squares. Sophia's brow furrowed with concentration as she traced a line carefully with a crayon. Lucia noticed Gabriel standing at the door and gestured for him to come closer. Without a word, Sophia finished her drawing and, after a brief pause, placed it gently beside Gabriel's papers on the table. Gabriel looked down and froze. It was a portrait of him. The lines were simple but surprisingly detailed for a child her age. His dark hair, the slight stubble on his jaw, even the crease that often formed between his eyebrows when he was thinking, all captured with quiet precision. Below the drawing, in a child's uneven handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for saving us from the fire." For a moment, Gabriel couldn't speak. His throat tightened as he turned to Lucia, who simply nodded, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's beautiful, Sophia," Gabriel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you like to draw?" Sophia nodded shyly but said nothing. Lucia explained, her hand gently stroking the child's hair. She hasn't spoken much since our parents died. The therapist said it's a response to trauma. Gabriel nodded, understanding far more than he cared to admit about how grief could silence a person. He looked at the drawing again, then carefully folded it and placed it in the pocket of his jacket, as if it was something fragile, something sacred. Later, that afternoon, while Sophia napped in the corner of the cabin, Gabriel unrolled the architectural plans for his hotel across the makeshift table. Lucia watched quietly from across the room, curiosity flickering behind her tired eyes. "What's that?" she asked finally. Gabriel smiled, smoothing the edges of the blueprint. "My project. I'm planning to turn the old hacienda into a hotel, something elegant, but still true to the land." Lucia stood and walked over, leaning in to examine the drawings. Her fingers hovered over the intricate designs, tracing the outlines of the arched doorways and tiled courtyards. "It's impressive," she admitted. "But what about the people here? Most of them are small business owners, barely making enough to survive." Gabriel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Initially, I was focused solely on the tourist aspect, but now I'm considering including a local development program, creating jobs, opportunities." Lucia looked at him, her expression softening. "That sounds different from the typical businessman." Gabriel chuckled quietly, the sound tinged with self-deprecation. "I haven't always been like this." He hesitated, then continued as if the words had been waiting years to surface. "I lost my younger sister when I was 22. Isabel. Leukemia." Lucia inhaled sharply, the raw honesty in his voice, catching her off guard. "I spent years after that burying myself in work, making money, thinking that success would fill the void." He shook his head slowly. But it didn't. Lucia sat down beside him, her eyes fixed on his. In that moment, she recognized something in him, a familiar grief, mirrored and refracted through their different lives. "You loved her very much," she said softly. Gabriel nodded, swallowing hard. "She was the only person who ever really understood me." A long silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside, the wind rustled through the eucalyptus trees, their leaves whispering secrets neither of them could quite decipher. Finally, Lucia broke the quiet. "I had to drop out of university after my parents died. I was studying medicine." Gabriel looked at her with genuine surprise. "Medicine?" She nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Yeah. I wanted to be a doctor, but after everything, I had to take care of Sophia." Gabriel's admiration for her deepened instantly. She wasn't just surviving, she was sacrificing, putting everything aside for the sake of her sister. "You're remarkable," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Lucia looked away, embarrassed by the intensity of his gaze. Before either could say more, the sound of tires crunching on gravel interrupted their moment. Both turned toward the window as a familiar figure emerged from the vehicle, Mariana Lopez. Gabriel sighed, standing up and heading outside to meet her. "Gabriel," she called, her voice clipped and professional as always. "We need to talk." He nodded and followed her to the other side of the cabin, out of earshot from Lucia and Sophia. Once they were alone, Mariana dropped the professional veneer. "What the hell are you doing?" she hissed, her eyes flashing with frustration. "We came here for business, not to get involved in some local drama." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "It's not a drama, Mariana. It's an abuse of power." She crossed her arms, glaring at him. "Your sister wouldn't have wanted this." The words hit Gabriel like a punch to the chest. "Don't bring Isabel into this," he snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. Mariana didn't flinch. "I'm just saying, ever since she died, you've become compulsive about saving. My people, not everyone wants to be saved, Gabriel." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. She wasn't entirely wrong. But this wasn't about some misguided savior complex. This was about justice. Mariana sighed, softening her tone. Look, I get it, but you need to think this through. Gabriel nodded, but said nothing. As Mariana climbed back into her car and drove off, Gabriel stood there for a long time, staring at the fading trail of dust her tires left behind. When he returned inside, Lucia was sitting quietly, folding another piece of paper into a small boat for Sophia, who was giggling softly now, her voice finally breaking through the silence. Gabriel smiled faintly at the sound, realizing just how much had changed in such a short time. Outside, the sun dipped below the hills, casting the landscape in hues of amber and crimson, as if the earth itself was bleeding out the last remnants of the day. And somewhere deep within Gabriel, something shifted, a subtle, almost imperceptible realignment of priorities and purpose. He knew now that staying uninvolved was no longer an option. This wasn't just about a hotel project anymore, it was about them. The days that followed unfolded like a tightly wound rope, fraying slowly at the edges. Gabriel could feel the tension building around him, as though the land itself held its breath. Each time he visited the cabin, he noticed subtle changes. Lucia no longer flinched when he approached, and Sophia, though still mostly silent, had begun to draw more. Images of trees, birds, and once a small sketch of the cabin itself, nestled among the mountains like a secret the world had forgotten. But the unease grew heavier when Gabriel tried to advance with his hotel project. He had gone to the municipal office early one morning, expecting a routine meeting to finalize the construction permits. Instead, he was met with polite smiles that felt as sharp as knives and a bureaucratic stone wall that refused to budge. "I'm sorry, Senor Soto," the official said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "It seems there are irregularities in your documentation. The project must be paused until they are resolved." Gabriel frowned, leaning across the desk. "What irregularities? Everything was filed weeks ago." The man shrugged, offering a non-committal smile. "Sometimes these things happen." Gabriel stepped out of the office, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The sun bore down mercilessly on the streets of Santa Clara, but the chill that swept through him had nothing to do with the weather. And then he saw him, leaning casually against a weathered column in the town plaza. Ricardo Peralta. He was dressed, impeccably as always, in a tailored suit that seemed both ostentatious and completely out of place in the dusty town. His smile was a crooked, venomous thing as Gabriel approached. "Welcome to Santa Clara, Senor Soto," Ricardo drawled, his voice dripping with false warmth. "I hope you're enjoying your stay." Gabriel stopped a few feet away, fixing him, with a stare cold enough to freeze the desert air. "I know what you're doing," Gabriel said quietly. Ricardo chuckled, straightening his lapels. "I'm simply reminding you how things work around here." "You don't scare me," Gabriel replied, his voice as steady as steel. Ricardo leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's not you I want to scare." Straightened and adjusted his cufflinks, then gestured lazily toward the horizon. "The Mesera and her little sister. They owe me." Gabriel's eyes darkened instantly. "Her name is Lucia," he corrected sharply, "and the girl is her sister." Ricardo smirked, unfazed. "The poor waitress with the colored hair. Quite the town gossip these days, you." "No, the rich outsider and the desperate woman. Makes for a good story." Gabriel took a step closer, his voice a low growl. "Leave them alone. Their debt is settled." Ricardo's smile widened, but his eyes gleamed with malice. "That's not how debts work, Soto, but enjoy your stay." With that, Ricardo tipped an imaginary hat and strolled leisurely across the plaza, disappearing into one of the colonial arcades. Gabriel stood there for a long moment, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with fury. The game was no longer subtle. Later that day, Gabriel returned to the cabin, his mind still reeling from the encounter. He found Lucia in the kitchen, preparing a pot of mole poblano, the rich, earthy aroma filling the small space with the comfort of something almost like home. He stood silently in the doorway, watching her stir the sauce, her movements precise. "And practiced. It was my mother's specialty," Lucia said suddenly without turning. "I thought, well, since you wanted to know more about the local cuisine." Gabriel smiled faintly, stepping inside. "It smells incredible." Lucia glanced over her shoulder, offering him a small, almost shy smile. They sat down to eat together, with Sophia perched quietly beside them, nibbling on a piece of bread while Gabriel helped clear the table. For a brief moment, the world outside the cabin, the threats, the debts, the fires, faded into a distant hum. But the next morning shattered that fragile peace. Mariana arrived. At the cabin unexpectedly, her expression tight with professional restraint as she asked to speak to Gabriel privately. They stepped outside, the air thick with the promise of rain. "This is getting out of hand," Mariana said, her tone clipped. "Ricardo's influence is stronger than we thought. The permits are blocked, suppliers are refusing to work with us, and—" She hesitated. "And—" "What?" Gabriel demanded. Mariana exhaled sharply. "And there are rumors that he's going to take legal action against Lucia." Gabriel's stomach dropped. "For what?" "For custody of Sophia." Gabriel stared at her, disbelief and rage colliding in his chest. "He can't," he whispered, though even as he said it, he knew that in towns like this, where power was a currency Ricardo held in abundance, he absolutely could. Mariana pressed a folder into his hands. "I pulled some documents," she said. "Ricardo's been preparing for this. He's filing a report with Child Services, claiming Lucia is unfit to care for her sister." Gabriel closed his eyes, inhaling slowly as the weight of the situation settled onto his shoulders. Later that evening, he sat with Lucia on the porch, the clouds finally breaking and a soft drizzle falling over the town. He told her everything. Lucia's hands tightened into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "He said he'd do this," she whispered, her voice hollow. Gabriel reached out, covering her hands with his own. "I won't let him," he promised. But the next morning the threat became real. A black car pulled up to the cabin, its tires crunching over the gravel. From it emerged a woman in a severe suit, clutching a leather briefcase, and a municipal officer who stood stiffly beside her. Gabriel stepped outside to meet them, Lucia right behind him, her body tense as a bowstring. "Señor Soto?" the woman asked. Gabriel nodded. "Elena Duran," she introduced herself briskly, extending a card. "Social Services." Lucia's breath caught in her throat. "We've received reports regarding the minor, Sofia Herrera," Elena continued, flipping open a folder. "Concerns about the stability and safety of her current living arrangement." Lucia's eyes widened in horror, and she instinctively stepped in front of the doorway, shielding Sophia within. "This is a misunderstanding," Gabriel interjected quickly. "Lucia is a devoted guardian." Elena didn't waver. "We still need to conduct an assessment." The next hour felt like a trial by fire. Elena asked questions about Lucia's income, her mental health, her relationship with Gabriel, all phrased with the cold precision of someone who had conducted these interviews dozens of times before. Lucia answered, her voice steady but strained, as Sophia clung silently to her side. When the officials finally left, leaving behind only a vague promise to follow up, Lucia collapsed onto the worn sofa, trembling. "They're going to take her," she whispered, staring blankly at the doorway. Gabriel sat beside her, uncertain whether to offer words or simply his presence. Lucia turned to him, her eyes wild with desperation. "I can't lose her," she said, her voice breaking. "She's all I have." Gabriel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You won't," he promised again, though this time the words felt more like a prayer than a certainty. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering against the roof as though the sky itself had turned against them. But inside that fragile shelter, beneath the storm, a quiet resolve began to take shape. Gabriel knew now that this wasn't just about defending Lucia's right to care for her sister. It was about dismantling the entire system that allowed men like Ricardo Peralta to flourish, and he was ready. The storm had passed by morning, but its residue lingered in the form of mud-soaked paths and heavy, humid air that clung to the skin. Gabriel stood by the window of the hacienda, staring out across the mist rising from the hills, his mind elsewhere. The image of Lucia's face, twisted in fear after the visit from social services, haunted him. It wasn't just fear for herself. It was that primal terror of someone standing at the edge, knowing they might lose the only thing anchoring them to the world. He couldn't shake the memory. By mid-morning, he made his decision. When he arrived at the cabin, Lucia was sitting on the porch, her head resting against one of the weathered beams, eyes closed, as if willing herself to be anywhere else but there. Sophia was inside, quietly coloring. Gabriel sat beside her, saying nothing at first. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in its own strained way. Then, softly, he said, "Come with me." Lucia opened her eyes, their edges rimmed with exhaustion and distrust. "Where?" "Somewhere I need you to see." She hesitated but ultimately nodded, calling out instructions to Sophia before following Gabriel to his truck. They drove in silence along the winding roads that skirted the edge of Santa Clara, the town giving way to fields, then to the dense thicket of trees where the land grew wilder. Finally, Gabriel stopped beside a rusted gate barely visible beneath. The ivy. He pushed it open, gesturing for Lucia to follow. Together they walked through the overgrown path, their footsteps muffled by fallen leaves and damp earth, until they reached a small clearing. At the center stood a simple headstone, modest and worn by time. The engraving was faint but unmistakable. "Isabel Soto, beloved sister and daughter, your light will forever shine." Lucia froze, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Gabriel knelt beside the grave, his hand brushing over the cool stone. "She died 8 years ago," he said quietly, not looking at Lucia. "Leukemia." Lucia stood beside him now, uncertain of what to say. "I promised her," Gabriel continued, his voice distant, as if pulled from someplace deep within him, "that I'd spend my life helping people. But after she was gone, I lost that. I'm part of myself. I buried it under contracts, deals, hotels." He looked up at Lucia, his eyes raw and exposed in a way she hadn't seen before. "Until I saw you, with those bruises, standing there, fighting for your sister." Lucia swallowed. Hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Why bring me here?" Gabriel stood, dusting his hands on his jeans, then turned to face her fully. "Because I wanted you to understand why this matters to me, why I can't walk away." The air between them thickened, not with words but with something more elemental: recognition. A silent understanding of what it means to lose, to love, to fight with everything you have left. Lucia nodded slowly, not trusting herself to speak. They stood there for a moment longer. Then Gabriel gestured gently toward the path. "Come on, there's somewhere else." They drove back into town, this time stopping at the cemetery's opposite end, where the newer graves stood in crisp, orderly rows. Lucia's breath caught as she recognized the names etched into a pair of marble stones: Antonio Herrera, Aurora Mendoza Herrera. Her parents. Gabriel remained a respectful distance away as Lucia knelt, pulling a few wildflowers from the edge of the path and arranging them at the base of each headstone with quiet reverence. "I miss them," she whispered, almost as if speaking to herself. "Every day." Gabriel crouched beside her, his voice soft. "You don't have to do all this alone." Lucia bit her lip, fighting back tears. "Sometimes," she said, her voice cracking. "Being strong means accepting help." Gabriel nodded. "Exactly." As they walked back toward the truck, Lucia exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Later that afternoon, back at the hacienda, Gabriel laid out his project plans on the wide oak table in his office. Mariana and Manuel were there too, the air thick with the tension of looming decisions. "I want to integrate the restaurant into the hotel," Gabriel announced, gesturing to the mock-up sketches. "Let it be reborn but not erased, and I want Lucia to run it." Mariana raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "And more than that," Gabriel continued, turning to Lucia, who had just arrived and stood awkwardly by the doorway, "I want you as part of the team." Lucia shook her head instantly, her hands coming up defensively. "No, I can't. Ricardo would never allow it. I still owe him." "I'll handle Ricardo," Gabriel interrupted firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Lucia looked at him, her eyes wide, torn between disbelief and an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I can't let you risk that," she said finally. Gabriel stepped closer, his tone quiet but resolute. "No one threatens my team." Mariana watched the exchange silently, then interjected with her usual pragmatism. "If they're going to be part of this, we need to formalize everything. Legal contracts, employee protections, and, more importantly, we need to neutralize Ricardo." Gabriel nodded in agreement. "Manuel," the lawyer adjusted his glasses, his expression thoughtful. "I've been gathering information. Ricardo's network is extensive, but it has cracks." He slid a folder across the table. "Proof?" Gabriel asked. "Not yet," Manuel admitted, "but enough leads to start building a case." Gabriel looked to Lucia, who stood there, visibly torn between hope and the weight of years spent surviving on her own. That evening, as Lucia tucked Sophia into bed, the little girl, who had barely spoken since the fire, looked up at her sister, her voice as fragile as the wings of the paper birds she often folded. "Are we staying with Mr. Gabriel?" she asked, her words halting but clear. Lucia felt her throat tighten, emotions she couldn't fully process welling up. "For now, my love," she whispered, smoothing Sophia's hair. "For now." Neither of them knew then just how much those simple words would come to mean. Meanwhile, elsewhere in town, Ricardo Peralta leaned back in his leather chair, staring out the window of his office. He swirled a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his expression calm, but his mind already calculating. His influence in Santa Clara was deep-rooted, his reach almost absolute. But now there was a new player, Gabriel Soto, and Ricardo wasn't about to let anyone, especially some self-righteous outsider, disrupt the careful balance of power he had spent years constructing. He picked up the phone, dialing a familiar number. "Make it difficult for him," he said simply, then ended the call without waiting for a response. The next morning, as Gabriel attempted to submit a fresh round of documents to push the hotel project forward, he was met at the municipal office by a familiar face, the same bureaucrat from before, his expression now bordering on smug. "I'm sorry, Senor Soto," he said, sliding a folder back across the desk. "There are new concerns. You'll have to start the application process from the beginning." Gabriel exhaled sharply, suppressing the surge of frustration threatening to boil over. As he turned to leave, the hair on the back of his neck prickled with the awareness of being watched. And there he was, Ricardo, leaning casually against a pillar just outside the building, as if he'd been waiting there all morning. Gabriel met his gaze directly, refusing to flinch. Ricardo offered a slow, mocking smile. "Some advice, Soto," he said smoothly, his voice barely above a whisper. As Gabriel passed by, "It's not a good idea to get involved in things that don't concern you." Gabriel didn't break stride, didn't look back, but inside, the fire was building. And he knew now, more than ever, that walking away was no longer an option. The atmosphere in Santa Clara had thickened to something nearly suffocating. What had once been a quiet town, where the pace of life mirrored the slow bend of the river, now felt like a chessboard, each piece carefully maneuvered under the oppressive gaze of Ricardo Peralta. Gabriel could feel it in every stalled document, every polite refusal from local suppliers, every sidelong glance in the market square. But it wasn't until Manuel arrived at the hacienda one evening, a manila folder tucked tightly under his arm, that Gabriel realized just how deep the game ran. "You need to see this," Manuel said, his voice grave as he laid out the contents of the folder across Gabriel's desk. Gabriel scanned the documents, his eyes narrowing as each page revealed a chilling new layer. Police reports, mechanical assessments, and, most disturbingly, inconsistencies surrounding the accident that had killed Lucia and Sofia's parents. "There are skid marks indicating another vehicle was involved," Manuel explained, tapping one of the photos with his pen. "But it was never investigated. Testimonies from 2 witnesses, both ignored." Gabriel leaned back, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "And who closed the case?" Manuel's mouth set into a hard line. "The chief of police at the time, Ricardo's cousin." Gabriel's stomach turned, not out of surprise, but from the confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect. "This wasn't an accident," he said quietly, his voice coated with a lethal calm. Manuel nodded. "We can't prove it yet, but there's more." He pulled out another document, a financial ledger. Antonio Herrera, Lucia's father. He was a bookkeeper for several local businesses, including Ricardo's. About 2 months before the accident, he'd reported irregularities in Ricardo's accounts. Gabriel exhaled sharply, his mind racing through the implications. Manuel continued, "Word is they had a heated argument at the municipal office. Some of the clerks remember it. And then, 2 weeks later, the accident." Gabriel stood abruptly, pacing toward the window, his fists clenched at his sides. "She can't know," he said finally, his voice heavy. "Not until we have proof." Manuel agreed silently. Meanwhile, at the cabin, Lucia was sorting through a box of salvaged belongings, her fingers trailing over the cracked leather cover of an old journal that had belonged to her mother. As she flipped through the pages, the faded ink blurred by years and smoke damage, a photo slipped out, a snapshot of her parents, standing proudly in front of La Casa del Café on its opening day. Lucia smiled faintly, a bittersweet ache pressing at her chest. Then, the knock at the door. She opened it to find a municipal officer standing alongside a woman with sharp features and an even sharper suit. "Elena Duran," the woman introduced herself crisply. "Department of Social Services." Lucia's heart plummeted. "We're here to follow up on the report concerning Sofia Herrera." Lucia's breath caught. "Report? What report?" The woman ignored the question, stepping past Lucia with practiced authority as the officer remained by the door. Within moments, Elena was inspecting the small cabin, the makeshift bed Sofia slept on, the sparse kitchen with its chipped dishes, the faded curtain shielding the single window. "We've received concerns about the miner's well-being," Elena said clinically, flipping through a file. "Financial instability, emotional distress, questions about your relationship with—" "Señor Soto." Lucia's face flushed, part indignation, part fear. "There is nothing inappropriate about my relationship with Gabriel," she said firmly. Elena didn't respond, simply scribbling a note. "And where is the child now?" Lucia called Sofia. Softly, the little girl emerged, clinging to her sister's side, her eyes wide and anxious. Elena crouched, offering a perfunctory smile. "Hi, Sofia. I'm here to make sure everything's okay. Do you feel safe here with your sister?" Sofia said nothing, just tightened her grip on Lucia's hand. The woman straightened, making another note. After an hour of sterile questions and thinly veiled insinuations, Elena and the officer left, promising to return for a more comprehensive assessment. As the car disappeared down the dusty road, Lucia crumpled onto the sofa, her head in her hands. When Gabriel arrived moments later, he found her there, trembling, her eyes rimmed red. "They're going to take her," she whispered, her voice hollow. Gabriel sat beside her, his arm automatically moving to wrap around her shoulders. "I won't let that happen," he said, his voice resolute. Lucia pulled away slightly, looking at him with a mixture of desperation and fury. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "Ricardo owns this town. If he wants her taken from me, he'll make it happen." Gabriel didn't argue. He knew she was right, but he also knew he wasn't leaving her to fight this alone. Later that night, while Sophia slept in the adjacent room, Lucia stood by the window, staring out into the dark expanse of the forest. Gabriel approached quietly, standing beside her. "My father," she began, her voice breaking. "He worked so hard for this family. He used to say that doing the right thing was always worth it, even if it cost everything." Gabriel swallowed hard, his mind flashing to the ledger, the police reports, the unsolved puzzle now starting to form a grim picture. Lucia continued, her voice softer. "But before the accident, he changed. He was distracted, always worried. I didn't understand it then. I just thought he was tired." Gabriel said nothing, letting her fill the silence. "He told my mother that he was correcting mistakes." She turned toward Gabriel, her eyes glistening. Do you think someone—" Her voice trailed off. Gabriel reached out, gently taking her hand. "I think your father was a good man," he said carefully, "who loved his family. And I think we need to find out the truth." Lucia nodded, a single tear escaping down her cheek. The next day, back at the hacienda, Gabriel and Manuel pored over more documents, piecing together the timeline, the connections, the motive. Mariana entered, her phone pressed to her ear. "We've got another problem," she said curtly, ending the call and tossing the device onto the table. Gabriel looked up sharply. "The suppliers," she said, rubbing her temples. "They've all pulled out. No one will work with us." "Ricardo," Gabriel muttered, already knowing. "And that's not all," Mariana continued. "The construction crew walked off the job this morning, said they didn't want any trouble." Gabriel stood, his voice dark with resolve. "Then it's time we brought this beyond Santa Clara." Manuel nodded. "I'll contact my people in the state capital. If we can't get justice here, we'll get it there." That evening, Lucia sat with Sophia at the cabin, helping her with her reading lessons, pretending for a brief moment that life was normal, that their days weren't bookended by threats and inspections. But just as Sophia began sounding out a word, a vehicle pulled up outside. Lucia's heart dropped. Gabriel stepped in quickly, his expression tense but controlled. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. Lucia stood, moving to meet him by the door as Sophia continued reading quietly. On the floor, Gabriel took her hands, holding them firmly. "We're going to fight this," he said simply. Lucia wanted to believe him, but as she glanced out at the car tracks leading away from their home and into the fog-shrouded streets of Santa Clara, she wondered how much longer they could hold on before everything finally gave way. The fog had thickened overnight, smothering the edges of the town and turning the roads into winding ghosts of themselves. But it wasn't the weather that made Gabriel's chest constrict when he pulled up to the cabin that morning. It was the door, left ajar, swaying gently with each breeze. He called out, but no voice returned. The air inside was eerily still, the thin curtains fluttering in the draught. Then he saw her, Lucia, crumpled on the floor by the sofa, her hand pressed against a darkening bruise at her temple, her breathing ragged and shallow. Gabriel dropped to his knees beside her, his Hands hovering, uncertain where to touch. Lucia, what happened? She opened her mouth, but only a fractured sob emerged. Then she thrust a crumpled note into his hands, her fingers trembling violently. Gabriel unfolded the paper, the words scrawled in harsh, unmistakable strokes. Now you know what it feels like to lose someone. Withdraw the complaint, or you won't see her again. Gabriel's heart stopped. He looked at Lucia, who was struggling to sit up, her face twisted in horror and disbelief. They took her, she gasped, her voice splintered. 2 men. They just came in. Her body shook uncontrollably, the retelling tearing her apart. I tried to stop them, she whispered, her fingers brushing against the bruised side of her face. They hit me, and then she was screaming my name. Her voice broke, the words crumbling under the weight of what had just happened. Gabriel pulled her close, holding her tightly as she sobbed into his chest, her fists beating weakly against him before going limp. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think, only feel the sheer magnitude of the loss crashing into them like a tidal wave. But then his mind snapped into focus. He pulled out his phone, dialing Manuel's number with a hand that barely steadied. They took Sophia, he said as soon as Manuel answered. We need help. Now. Lucia grabbed his arm, her eyes wide. And wild, no police, she pleaded, her voice sharp with panic. Ricardo said, if we called them. Gabriel cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me, he said firmly. We're going to find her, I promise you. Lucia nodded, though her entire body was still trembling. Within 20 minutes, Manuel and Mariana were at the hacienda. They gathered in Gabriel's office, the walls now lined with maps, files, and every fragment of intelligence they had collected about Ricardo's operations. Mariana was the first to break the tense silence. If he's making this personal now, he's desperate, Manuel nodded grimly. Desperate men make mistakes. Gabriel unfolded the note and laid it on the table between them. He wants me to withdraw the complaint and sign over the hacienda, Mariana scoffed bitterly. So he wins. Gabriel shook his head, his jaw set like stone. Not this time. Lucia stood by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes staring blankly into the courtyard. Then, suddenly, she turned toward the table, her voice cutting through the heavy air. He has a property, an old finca, she said, her tone urgent, on the outskirts of town, abandoned for years. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. You're sure? Lucia nodded. My father used to take me there when he did Ricardo's bookkeeping. I know it. Manuel pulled out his phone, making a few quick calls to trusted contacts in the state police. Ensuring discretion, as they coordinated the approach, Lucia sank into a chair, her fingers gripping the arms so tightly her knuckles turned white. Gabriel sat beside her, his hand resting gently over hers. We're going to bring her back, he said quietly, his voice resolute. Lucia looked at him, her eyes filled with a grief so raw it seemed impossible for anyone to hold. Yet here she was, still standing, still fighting. An hour later, as they prepared to leave, Mariana stopped Gabriel by the door. You're sure about this? She asked, her voice low. Gabriel looked back at Lucia, then at the note still lying on the table. I've never been more sure of anything. They divided into 3 groups. Manuel with 2 plainclothes officers from the state, Mariana coordinating a backup team, and Gabriel with Lucia, who had flatly refused to be left behind. I'm not staying here while they have her, she said, her voice a steady burn. Gabriel didn't argue. The drive out to the old finca was silent, save for the low rumble of the engine and the occasional crackle of radio communication between the teams. The landscape blurred past them, all twisted trees and parched earth, until finally the crumbling silhouette of the finca rose up from the mist, a monolith of decayed stone and long-forgotten cruelty. There it is, Lucia whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Gabriel pulled the truck off the road, parking behind a copse of trees. Through the binoculars, they could see faint movement inside. A shadow crossing past a cracked window, the glint of light off something metallic. "She's in there," Lucia said, her voice trembling but certain. Gabriel squeezed her hand gently. "We go in together." The team surrounded the property, taking up positions as planned. Gabriel turned to Lucia one last time. "Stay close. Don't try to be a hero." Lucia met his gaze steadily. "She's my sister." Gabriel nodded, then signaled the advance. They moved swiftly through the overgrown yard, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves and moss. The air smelled of mildew and rot, a fitting cloak for the darkness that had taken root inside. Inside the finca, the corridors twisted and turned like the veins of some decaying creature, leading them deeper into its heart. And then, a sound. Faint, but unmistakable. A voice, singing. Lucia gasped softly, her hands flying to her mouth. "It's her," she whispered, tears springing instantly to her eyes. They followed the sound to a door at the far end of the hall, locked from the outside. Gabriel was just positioning himself to force it open when a figure emerged from the shadows behind them. Ricardo, stepped forward with calculated calm, raising a gun, his face contorted in a mixture of triumph and rage. "You should have walked away, Soto," he hissed. Before Gabriel could react, the gunshot echoed through the decaying halls. Instinctively, Gabriel shoved Lucia aside, the searing pain exploding through his shoulder as he hit the ground hard. Chaos erupted. The officers charged in, their weapons drawn, shouts piercing the stagnant air. Ricardo bolted, but Manuel tackled him to the floor, wrenching the gun from his grip as Lucia scrambled to Gabriel's side. "You're hurt," she cried, pressing her hands over the growing stain of blood on his shirt. "I'm fine," he gritted through the pain, gesturing toward the locked door. "Get her." Lucia fumbled with the latch, forcing it open with trembling hands, and there in the corner of the dim, musty room sat Sophia, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes wide but dry. The moment she saw her sister, she sprang up and ran straight into Lucia's arms. "I knew you'd come," she sobbed, burying her face in her sister's neck. Lucia held her tightly, rocking her gently as tears streamed down her face. Gabriel watched the reunion through a haze of pain and relief, his head leaning back against the cold stone wall, the tension finally releasing in his chest. Outside, as the officers dragged Ricardo away in handcuffs, Manuel knelt beside Gabriel, examining the wound. "Through and through," he said, wincing. "You'll live." Gabriel chuckled weakly, then winced at the pain. Lucia appeared moments later, cradling Sophia in one arm, her other hand reaching out to Gabriel. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Gabriel smiled faintly, gripping her hand. "I promised." And as the dawn began to break over the distant hills, casting the crumbling finca in pale gold light, they all stepped out together, leaving the darkness behind them. The morning sun crept steadily above the ridges of Santa Clara, casting long shadows over the town as the news of Ricardo Peralta's arrest spread like wildfire. By the time Gabriel was stabilized at the local hospital, whispers had already transformed into open conversations. For years, Ricardo had been the man whose name people only dared to speak in hushed tones, but now he was just another criminal, shackled and silent, awaiting transfer to the state capital. Gabriel lay in the sterile hospital room, his arms strapped across his chest in a makeshift sling, the bandages around his shoulder fresh and tight. The gunshot had torn through muscle, but missed anything vital. Still, the dull ache persisted with every breath, every movement, reminding him of how close it all had come to ending differently. The door creaked open quietly, and Manuel stepped, in carrying a thick folder under one arm and 2 paper cups of coffee. Gabriel smirked faintly, accepting one of the cups as Manuel sat beside him. "You look like hell," Manuel said dryly. Gabriel chuckled, then grimaced at the sharp stab of pain in his shoulder. Feel like it too. Manuel set the folder down on the tray table beside the bed and exhaled slowly. You should see this. Gabriel eyed the folder warily, then nodded. Manuel opened it and began laying out the documents. Financial ledgers, handwritten notes, photographs, all collected from the finca and Ricardo's office during the arrest. It was more than just evidence of kidnapping and assault. It was a meticulous archive of Ricardo's crimes. Extortion records, bribes, even blueprints of fraudulent schemes woven through the town's economy. But one document made Gabriel freeze. It was a mechanic's report, one that detailed the deliberate tampering of Antonio Herrera's car brakes. It wasn't just a suspicion, Manuel said quietly. It was murder. Gabriel swallowed hard, the weight of that truth settling heavily in the sterile air of the hospital room. And this, Manuel continued, holding up a sealed envelope, was left with a notary by Antonio Herrera, a letter to be delivered only in the event of his death. Gabriel's chest tightened. Manuel handed it over, but Gabriel shook his head slowly. Lucia should read it, he said firmly. Manuel nodded in agreement. As they sat there in silence, the door opened again, and Lucia entered, her hand wrapped tightly around Sophia's. The little girl smiled shyly at Gabriel, then climbed onto the chair beside his bed, her small hand brushing gently against his good arm. Gabriel smiled, though his throat tightened at the sight of her safe, whole, and finally at peace. You're okay, Sophia whispered, her voice delicate but filled with quiet conviction. Gabriel nodded. Thanks to you too. Lucia sat down at the foot of the bed, her eyes scanning the papers scattered across the tray table. More of Ricardo's empire, she asked. Gabriel nodded but said nothing. Lucia reached over, squeezing his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, a softness, an openness that hadn't been there before. Thank you, she said quietly. For everything. Gabriel swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded, his fingers tightening slightly around hers. Manuel cleared his throat and stood. I'll leave you two to talk, he said, giving Gabriel a meaningful look before slipping out of the room. For a long moment, neither Gabriel nor Lucia spoke. They just sat there, surrounded by the quiet beeping of medical monitors and the distant murmur of hospital life. Then Lucia broke the silence. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel frowned slightly. For what? For blaming you when Sophia was taken, for thinking, even for a second, that it was your fault. Gabriel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You were terrified, he said gently. I would have been too. Lucia looked down at her hands, twisting them together in her lap. But you didn't give up. You risked everything. Gabriel smiled, faintly. So did you. Their eyes met then, and the distance that had always hovered between them quietly dissolved. A nurse entered briefly to check Gabriel's vitals, then left, leaving them alone once more. Lucia glanced at Sophia, who had now curled up in the chair, dozing softly, her breathing steady and peaceful. Then she looked back at Gabriel. What happens now? She asked. Gabriel leaned his head back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling for a long moment before answering. Ricardo will stand trial, not just for Sophia, but for everything. The extortion, the murder of your parents, all of it. Lucia closed her eyes, the weight of those words settling heavily in her chest. And us? She asked quietly, the question almost lost in the hum of the hospital machines. Gabriel turned his head slowly to look at her. That depends, he said carefully. Do you trust me? Lucia didn't hesitate this time. Yes. Gabriel smiled, then winced again at the pain in his shoulder. Lucia laughed softly at his expression and stood, leaning over to kiss his forehead gently. As she straightened, Gabriel caught her hand. "Lucia," he began, then faltered. "But—" She leaned in, her voice close to his ear. "I know." And that was enough. In the days that followed, Santa Clara seemed to awaken from a long, oppressive slumber. With Ricardo in custody and his network of fear and corruption dismantled piece by piece, the townspeople began to emerge from behind their walls. Whispers of hope replaced years of silence. The construction on the hacienda resumed, this time with an influx of local workers eager to be part of something new, something untethered from the legacy of fear that had ruled for so long. The first day Gabriel was strong enough to leave the hospital, he returned to the hacienda, his arm still, in a sling but his spirit renewed. He found Lucia and Sofia there, already helping Doña Carmen oversee preparations for the reopening of La Casa del Café, now redesigned as the heart of the new hotel. Lucia looked up from the counter as Gabriel entered, and a radiant smile broke across her face. "You're supposed to be resting," she teased. Gabriel grinned, walking carefully across the newly tiled floor. "And miss this?" He looked around at the bustling space, the aroma of fresh coffee filling the air, the sound of workers hammering and laughing outside in the courtyard. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. Lucia nodded, her eyes glistening. "It's home." Sofia ran up then, clutching a new drawing in her hand. "For you," she announced proudly, holding it up. Gabriel took it carefully and smiled. It was a picture of the three of them, hand in hand, standing in front of the hacienda beneath a bright yellow sun. Above them, written in bright, uneven letters, were the words, "My family." Gabriel's throat tightened as he crouched down, pulling Sofia into a gentle hug. "Thank you," he whispered. Lucia watched them, her heart swelling with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting the land in a soft amber glow, Gabriel and Lucia sat together on the porch of the newly restored cabin. Sofia had fallen asleep inside, her drawings scattered across the table. Lucia rested her head against Gabriel's uninjured shoulder, and for a long time neither spoke. Then quietly, Lucia said, "We made it." Gabriel smiled, leaning his cheek gently against the top of her head. "Yeah," he whispered. "We did." And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat there in silence, wrapped in the warmth of something neither had expected. But both now knew they couldn't live without. 5 years passed, almost imperceptibly, like the gentle current of the river winding past Santa Clara's hills. The town, once shrouded in silence and fear, now bustled with life and possibility. The old hacienda, transformed into the Soto Herrera Community and Cultural Center, stood as a testament to resilience and rebirth, its whitewashed walls gleaming under the steady Mexican sun. Gabriel stood at the edge of the lake that bordered the property, his hands tucked into his pockets, watching as Sofia, now 13, chased a group of butterflies through the wildflowers. Her laughter rang out across the water, light and easy, as if the weight of her early years had long since been lifted. Behind him, Lucia approached, her steps steady and sure. She had grown into herself in these years, her strength no longer hidden behind walls of fear. Her white medical coat flapped softly in the breeze as she walked, a stethoscope slung around her neck, symbol not just of her profession, but of a promise fulfilled. Gabriel turned as she reached him, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. "Dr. Herrera," he greeted playfully. Lucia laughed softly and slipped her hand into his. "Come on," she said. "They're waiting." They made their way back through the gardens of the hacienda, where preparations for the evening celebration were underway. The newly planted trees lining the cobblestone paths cast long shadows, while local musicians tuned their instruments under the shade of the great oak that had once been a mere sapling, planted in memory of those they had lost. Inside the main hall, Doña Carmen was directing the kitchen staff with her usual matriarchal authority, though her steps had slowed slightly with age. La Casa del Café had not only been rebuilt, but had flourished, now recognized nationwide for its preservation of traditional cuisine. As Gabriel passed through, Doña Carmen pulled him into a quick embrace. "You did good, muchacho," she said, her voice warm and proud. Gabriel smiled, his gaze drifting toward the center of the room, where a marble statue stood, shrouded in a white cloth. The ceremony to unveil it would begin at sunset, a tribute to Antonio and Aurora Herrera, whose courage had sparked the transformation of this entire town. "Ready?" Manuel asked, stepping up beside him. The former lawyer now served as the district judge, having returned to Santa Clara to help oversee the legal and social reforms that continued to ripple outward from Ricardo's downfall. Gabriel nodded. They all gathered in the plaza as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of rose and amber. Sophia stood proudly beside Lucia and Gabriel, her sketchpad tucked under her arm, as the townspeople filled every corner of the square, their faces reflecting both solemn remembrance and joyful anticipation. Manuel stepped to the podium. "Today, we honor Antonio and Aurora Herrera," he began, his voice resonant and clear. "Their integrity and sacrifice laid the foundation for the community we have become." With that, the cloth was pulled away, revealing the bronze figures of Lucia and Sophia's parents, standing side by side, their expressions eternal in metal. Antonio with his accounting ledger, Aurora holding a bouquet of local wildflowers. The inscription below read, "In courage they planted, in hope we flourished." Lucia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the likeness of her parents. Gabriel slid an arm around her waist, holding her close. "They would be so proud of you," he whispered. Lucia nodded, blinking back tears. Later, as the crowd dissipated into clusters of shared meals and music, Gabriel led Lucia and Sophia to a quieter corner of the gardens. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving a small, worn leather journal from the pocket of his blazer. Lucia's eyes widened as she recognized it. "My mother's—" she whispered. Gabriel nodded. "We found it while clearing the last of the old storage rooms." Lucia opened it carefully, her fingers brushing over the fragile pages filled with recipes, sketches, and notes, tiny pieces of her mother's life preserved in ink. At the very back she found a photograph, Gabriel as a teenager, standing beside a young woman with a radiant smile. Lucia gasped softly. "My mother." Gabriel chuckled. "We had a summer together, a long time ago. I didn't realize until I saw this." Lucia looked at the photo, then at Gabriel, realization dawning. All these years, our lives were already woven together. Gabriel smiled and took her hand. "Some things," he said, "are meant to find their way back." Just then, Sophia interrupted them, waving her sketchpad. "Come see," she said, pulling them both toward a bench beneath the oak tree. She opened her pad to reveal her latest piece, a family portrait, the three of them sitting together with two faint, small figures in the background. Lucia stared, puzzled. "What are these?" she asked. Sophia grinned mischievously. "They're the new babies." Lucia laughed and glanced at Gabriel, who was already pulling a small envelope from his pocket. Inside was an ultrasound image, two tiny forms floating side by side. Lucia's hands flew to her mouth, tears springing instantly to her eyes. "Twins," she whispered. Gabriel nodded, his voice thick with emotion. 2 months. Lucia threw her arms around him, and Sophia squealed with delight, wrapping them both in a hug. The laughter carried up through the branches of the oak, drifting over the lake and across the fields. That evening, after the celebration had ended and the plaza quieted under the blanket of stars, the family made one last stop together. They walked to the base of the oak, where a wooden bench had been placed in memory of all they had endured and overcome. They sat there in silence, watching the constellations emerge one by one in the night sky. Sophia leaned her head against Lucia's shoulder, while Gabriel rested his hand over Lucia's belly, already imagining the lives growing there. Lucia exhaled softly, her heart finally unburdened. "You know what's amazing?" Sophia said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "What?" Lucia asked, smiling. "That everything changed. Because Gabriel noticed your scars." Lucia ran her fingers gently along her cheek, where the faintest trace of her old wound remained. What had once been a mark of pain was now barely visible, a silent testament to a path walked, a battle fought, and a future claimed. Gabriel looked at her, then out across the darkened town, its windows glowing with life. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "it's the scars that show us where to go." The three of them sat there, wrapped in the warmth of each other, the past at peace, the future wide open. And as the moon rose high above Santa Clara, casting silver light over the land they had reclaimed, one truth became clear. Some stories don't end. They evolve, they grow, just like families, just like love.